everyone, and welcome to Nolan Navigates. I'm Beth Nolan, private wealth advisor for Raymond James, and today we're having a conversation about something increasingly important to many of the families I work with: how to approach philanthropy with the same intentionality, clarity, and alignment that we bring to wealth planning and legacy building. To explore this, I'm joined by a trusted philanthropic advisor, Shari Fox. Shari is a seasoned major and principal gifts professional with 30 years of experience. And she works as an integral part of clients' advisory teams, helping donors implement thoughtful plans that align their values, goals, and long-term legacy. Shari, thanks for joining us. I'm so delighted to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Many of my clients are deeply charitably minded, but they often tell me they want more clarity around how to give, not just how much. So from your perspective, how does philanthropic consulting and work with people like me and their clients?
Well, for charitably minded individuals, a philanthropic advisor's experience and expertise really works hand in glove with their financial advisor's expertise. You know, I always think about charitable giving decisions falling into two major buckets. One is the what, the other is the how. So the what decisions are all about, you know, what's the impact that the client wants to have? What are the areas or issues that they wish to impact? And ultimately, what are the organizations they believe will make that change that they want to affect? From there, then, the how decisions are those ones where really I work very closely with the financial advisor. That's what's the right structure for these gifts? What's the right timing? What's the right assets to give?
Yep.
Is all of it going to be now? Is some of it going to be later? And that's really important that be aligned with their other financial decisions and work with all of their personal financial goals. So that's really where the financial advisor's expertise, where your expertise is particularly important in the giving structure.
Right. I see clients struggle not with just generosity focus. They care about many causes and aren't always sure where they can make the most impact. How do you help clients define their charitable vision?
This is a great point. And I will say, even for my own charitable giving, I struggle with that as well. And it's not unusual for people to then do what we sometimes call spray and pray philanthropy, right? Give a little to a lot of places and hope it's going to do some good. So often when I start working with clients, we really do start from that piece of identifying what is the impact they really want to have and what does success look like for them. So I really have a series of questions and exercises that my clients work through to help them define that focus, including, not only the issues, but what populations they want to impact. I mean, you take something like education or health. Those are huge. So narrowing that down to more specifics so that they come away with really basically a philanthropic mission statement that can drive the majority of their giving, especially their larger gifts, help them determine what's in and what's out. And then there's always room for those things that come up, those emerging opportunities, whether it's because of a crisis or, a humanitarian issue, because their friend or family member or business associate is involved in something important to them. There should always be those funds that are available to make those gifts. And then where you're really investing larger dollars or over the long term is more in those areas that are aligned with that focus. So really starting from helping people define what that looks like for them is often the first part of our work together.
The issue of those emergencies and the crisis that come up.
Yes.
I see that a lot with our folks in Florida when they've experienced a hurricane. They want to help their neighbors.
Absolutely.
It becomes very deeply personable, but also finding that right organization that's going to get the help back to their immediate communities and doing it in a fiscally responsible way. And a lot of times they're at a loss. They know that they want to help. They don't know which organization that is going to redirect that money back in the most meaningful way.
Right. And a lot of times I have those conversations, outside of where we were originally working, when there are those emergencies or a particular issue comes up and we can talk about, what is it you want to do? If it were a client of yours, I would say, if you talk with Beth about this in terms of, assets to be available. And I can sometimes be of help in identifying whether it's one organization or quite often it's here's a few that are really operating in that area. And here's why I think they are ones worth you considering.
Yeah.
So
we have a number of our clients that are transient in retirement.
Mm-hmm.
They start out in a town where they have built their wealth and they've raised their family, and then they maybe go to someplace warmer climate, or they go to where their children are, and they aren't as rooted in that community as they were. They still want to be philanthropic and to be able to make those charitable gifts, but they're just at a loss of how to do that. So is part of your service helping them, maybe reestablish relationships with places that
Absolutely.
are meaningful to, or organizations that are meaningful to them?
Absolutely. And for instance, as you said, people are transient. They're also sometimes multi-located,
Yes.
co-located.
Sure.
How would we say that? But there's a client I work with who is based in the Chicago area, but has had a place and a relationship in Door County for years. And as she started thinking about what she wanted to do, it's the first time she's really making larger philanthropic decisions. And in that determining focus, she brought up, there's a lot of issues in the Door County community. I would like to do something there. So that was one of the earliest ways I worked with her, was in helping define that, helping research. And actually, I worked with the Door County Community Foundation, I think that's the right name, but to help her organize that giving there and really help her know where she knows the area well, but they always are going to know what are the emerging needs there, what organizations are really operating well in different areas of support. So that's an example of how that can play out.
That's great. So structuring gifts for legacy and impact. One area where I see tremendous value is in structuring charitable gifts in a way that supports both impact and legacy. What are some of the ways that you can help clients think beyond that one-time gift and more about their longer-term impact?
Yeah. Well, this is an area where I work most often with their financial advisor, who's looking at all of those things, right? When you're working with clients, I'm sure you're looking at supporting their short, intermediate, and long-term needs. And how this plays out often depends on where I come into the relationship. So sometimes it starts with one particular major gift that someone is making. It can also happen when there's a liquidity event, and it's maybe a tax-driven situation. But quite often it happens when people's wealth has grown to a level that maybe they didn't anticipate, and they're reevaluating their estate plan. So I'll give you an example that I think is one of my favorite client relationships, because I really do work as part of her team of advisors. She came to me. She is widowed. She has stepdaughters, but no children of her own, a couple of nieces she's very close with. Her husband died several years ago. And she has good financial management. She lives a modest lifestyle. She has a good pension. She was in her early 70s. And her wealth has grown to a level she never expected to have. She literally teared up when she told me that. So she was rethinking her estate plan because she felt like she still wanted to benefit, of course, her stepdaughters and honor her late husband's wishes for them and his charitable priorities, help her nieces, but she didn't want them to get as much as they would get. And she's always been very involved in the community. So that first phase was helping her step back and think about, okay, in this charitable chunk, what aspects do you really want to support? And what's the best way to do that for the long term? And so some of that went directly to organizations, some set up some endowment funds that will be funded with her through her estate. And then every year, we look at what does that mean based on your net worth right now. We also look at her annual giving plan for the year, and what changes she might want to make. Are there particular needs in one area where she may want to do something more this year? Now we're at the point really of, because her wealth has continued to grow, thinking about, especially she is here in the state of Illinois, which has this Illinois Gives tax credit opportunity. So she is using, where most of her annual giving comes from her required minimum distribution from her IRA. She last year, and we may be considering this again this year, has given some appreciated securities towards one of the endowment funds that's mostly going to benefit from her estate. So she can benefit from the tax credit and start putting that money to work in that area of support now.
And she can see a little bit of the fruits of her labor while she's alive.
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about multi-gen households and transferring values through charitable giving. One of the things I see families grappling with is how to talk to their children and grandchildren about money in a values-based way, not just numbers on a balance sheet. And oftentimes they want to involve their children and grandchildren in decision-making, but not sure when to bring them in and exactly how much they want to divulge during the process. So how do you work with families in structuring a multi-generation charitable giving plan that can help translate those values over the years?
Right. That's a really important topic and a difficult one. It's very interesting. I'm sure you see this in your work with your clients, the difficulty people have in talking about money and wealth with their children and maybe grandchildren as that comes along. And part of a way to do that is to frame it in what that wealth makes possible. So there are a few things. There are some families I've worked with who I've been very impressed in how they get their children involved even when their children are young. So, age-appropriate activities like the expectation that a portion of their allowance or chore money goes to charitable purposes. Maybe, so many parents are like, my kids just keep accumulating stuff. Well, kind of having that tradition that after their birthday, when they get a bunch of new toys, maybe an older toy goes to children who don't have as much. So putting some of those in place, volunteering together as they hit middle age. And then in high school and college, involving those children in their annual philanthropic decisions, maybe allowing them to advocate for something that's important to them. And it's kind of fun to watch that evolve. And then really as in those later years, when they're thinking about, are they involving their children in long-term philanthropy? My suggestions often come about having those family meetings, if you will, or conversations. It can start in those, annual giving this year, and let's talk about what we're doing. And in later time, really, it's important for them to talk with their children about what role philanthropy is playing in their long-term planning, what that's going to mean for after they're gone. And it's an opportunity for the parents to learn about how their children are approaching philanthropy, if they are, for the children to understand what's important to their parents and what their expectations are for how that carries forward after their lifetimes. So particularly if you're using a multi-generational tool like a donor advised fund, or even more importantly in a private foundation where it can go on for multiple generations, is deciding together what those parameters are going to be for how giving decisions are made, involving family in appropriate ways at different ages in making those decisions, and being clear about how much you want the first generation, how you want your philanthropic priorities carried out, which I also, as I'm facilitating some of these discussions, encourage that room for what's important for their children and for generations to come, and to allow for the fact that needs, even in existing communities, change over time. So, exercise influence more than control.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. It makes me think about my own children, and maybe I need to be starting some of these traditions as they're, in high school and becoming adults, and making sure that I'm doing this with them. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
All right. What have you seen emerge from these shared decision-making conversations? How do they help families better understand differing passions, building empathy, and learning from one another?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I see is usually I'm going to say both generations or all generations learn something about the other. It's a great way to learn how family values have evolved into different priorities for other generations, and to really understand what's behind those. It also builds appreciation, I think, among the younger generations for the older generations and how they've thought about, first of all, building and preserving that wealth, understanding the importance to that generation of what they're making possible for the younger generations. And I usually see both families learn about causes and organizations they really hadn't thought about. So it's again an opportunity to truly admire and respect the multiple generations and the individuals in the family. The other aspect of making philanthropic decisions together is to build respect and a process for making decisions across different opinions. So a lot of the families who are thinking about this philanthropy for multiple generations have other wealth that's going to be multiple generations. They may have family businesses where now their kids, maybe their kids and their cousins are going to be inheriting or being brought in now into a family business.
Or farmland.
Here in Illinois, boy, have I come to appreciate that.
Yeah.
Farming as a going business, whether they're doing it themselves or not. And they're going to have to make decisions together around money, around resources. So starting that earlier around philanthropy helps them learn how to make decisions when opinions differ. So it can be a great, I often say the donor advised fund, the private foundation can be a good training ground for families in making decisions together. It's very important, yet it gives them an opportunity to make some, I'm going to call them mistakes, maybe not great choices, or maybe struggle with how they're making decisions when opinions differ, where the stakes are lower than if they're doing that in a business setting.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Great point. Okay. All right. There are many different ways to give. So we talked a little bit about donor advised funds, whether that's a private donor advised fund or through a community foundation, family foundations, direct gifts, and even giving the RMDs away through IRAs.
Yeah.
How does your role as a philanthropic advisor work across all of these structures?
The first part of it goes back to the what and the how. So, I always believe you start with the what. I had a boss early in my career who used to say form follows function. So, what are you trying to accomplish? And then what's the best way to do that? And clarifying those short and long-term objectives helps determine what's the right tool. So this is where, when we have that what decision, I work closely with the financial advisor to determine what's the right tool for now. It's quite often, it's not just one structure that works best. It may be a donor advised fund, and then some. For instance, the IRA RMDs, now that we have, I remember when the qualified charitable distribution came into being, when the legislation passed in 2006, allowing that, and how that's grown over time. Well, you can't make a qualified charitable distribution to a donor advised fund or to a private foundation. So there's often multiple structures and multiple assets that are going to be best for what the client's trying to accomplish, and how that aligns with the rest of their financial goals. So that's where, I really appreciate when my clients consider me part of their advisory team. And like the woman I was talking about before in the example, her financial advisor, he knows, and I know that we have her permission to share information. So, every year we start out for that year's plan with what's her required minimum distribution going to be this year, what's her net worth, so we can look at what would that mean tragically if something happened this year, how would that be distributed. So the work really goes across the what and the how. It does matter how they're funding it, but in terms of my involvement, it usually crosses across that.
That's great.
That spectrum.
Yeah. One thing that I've started to see as an emerging trend in philanthropy, where I feel like the structures and maybe the IRS code have not exactly caught up, or they're not exactly aligned.
Yeah.
That is values-based investing.
Yes.
Making direct investments in companies that are kind of charitable, kind of a business.
Right.
They're not a nonprofit, but in some cases, there are some donor advised funds out there that allow for gifts to to these types of organizations. Are you seeing this as a trend? How are you incorporating this in? And where does it fit in, especially those multi-generational conversations where maybe the older generations don't even know that this is an option.
Right.
The younger generations are maybe a little bit more leaning towards this is the kind of philanthropic gift I'd like.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I find impact investing really interesting and something I'm continuing to learn more about. And I do think it's a growing trend. I also think we are just really developing expertise in that area, particularly for families with a significant amount of wealth that they want to devote to the common good. I always think that impact investing may have a role in some of that, because with impact investing, there is a financial return and there's a societal return. And in certain areas of philanthropic focus, like I'll give you an example. One of my philanthropic priorities is environmental sustainability. Well, that's going to take more than philanthropy, right? There's public policy issues, so advocacy plays a role in that. There's certainly impact investing opportunities because there are a lot of new technologies that may work as part of our solution for environmental sustainability. So I think that should be part of the conversation. Depending, you're right, that's not a tax deductible option that you can't, if you put your IRA money in that, you're basically taking a taxable distribution and then making an investment. There are some opportunities, though, in a private foundation. So this is part of where the form follows function comes in, is conversations before a decision to put everything in a donor advised fund versus a private foundation. If impact investing, if program-related investments, that's part of what a private foundation can do that is a little different than, a donor advised fund could certainly, if the investment manager wants to put some money into those impact investments, that's a great opportunity. And if that's important to the client, to the donor, then the organization managing the assets in that donor advised fund should know that. Yeah. Right. But it's not a grant from the fund.
Okay. So what are some of the advantages and limitations you help clients consider with common giving structures like a donor advised fund and a family foundation?
It's a great question. Quite often, a major decision is between those two vehicles, or maybe how much to combine the two. So I think there's a few areas to consider. And I will say, for most donors, a donor advised fund is the better option, but I still think there's a role that private foundations play, and they can be a good tool, if not the best tool for some donors. So the first is the current and likely future amount going to philanthropy. I don't know, and you may have a good sense of what the magic number is for a private foundation, but I usually think it's around the $10 million mark.
Where I would say.
Okay.
I can do anything less than that.
Right.
Probably.
To start, but I see a lot of them that are less than that. So that's one thing, because they are more expensive and cumbersome. So to make that worthwhile, right. The second is the level of complexity and expertise that the family is willing to shoulder or pay others to help manage and administer for them. Because, with a donor advised fund, it's pretty much done.
Yes.
You get to make the recommendations for the grants, but you don't have to do any filing or tax filing, accounting, investment decisions. You can inform those, but not make those. Some considerations around the funding assets. There are certain assets that the tax benefits are different, and they are typically greater no matter what asset you're going to fund with. In a donor advised fund, you usually get a higher deduction than you will in a private foundation, but you also have to consider if they will be accepted by the sponsoring charity. So those are a concern. The tax benefits, which I mentioned. Another big one is the level of direct involvement the donor wants to maintain. So that is quite limited in a donor advised fund. Whereas in a private foundation, you're directly involved in, with a donor advised fund, technically you're recommending the grants in most cases. If they're going to a qualified 501c3 public charity, the sponsoring charity will approve those, but they have the ultimate decision.
Yep.
If you want to be very involved in how those decisions are made, in directing the investments, then a private foundation may make sense. Also, if you want to do some program-related investments, if you want to include a component where you can support individuals, you actually can do that through a private foundation. There are a lot of rules about that, but that may be an option. And then to what extent do you want to involve other generations and for how long? So if you're looking at a considerable amount of assets and you want it to be a lasting legacy across many generations, then it might be that a private foundation is a better choice. There's also some issues around transparency. A private foundation, you file a 990 PF that's searchable. It's public record. With a donor advised fund, you can name it for your dog, and maybe nobody knows that that's yours. Depends on what level of privacy you really want around that giving. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So required minimum distributions. This is an area where I call it the kind of keep it simple, stupid when it comes to doing your charitable giving each year. We're seeing a lot more conversations around RMDs. They're getting bigger because the assets are growing. And they now begin at age 73, but especially with those clients who have larger IRAs. How have you seen over the years that has shifted charitable giving behavior?
It's a great question. So I think most of how that has shifted is because of how those RMDs are growing. A donor can do a qualified charitable distribution from their IRA at age 70 and a half, because that has not changed even as the minimum age has gone up. But because many people aren't taking RMDs until at least 73, the assets have grown even more. I mean, we've had some incredible returns recently. So first of all, they are surprised by how much their advisor is saying they need to take this year. Quite often, they don't need that to maintain their lifestyle, and this is going to increase their taxable income. So they're thinking about the opportunity to make larger charitable gifts or more than they have before. So that's driving a lot of questions about, well, how do I make decisions? I worked with a client who actually, I was brought in by her financial advisor, I think it was November of last year, because she was paralyzed, frankly, by the decisions about where to, she was near the limit. Last year, there was 108,000, I believe, that she was near that limit in her required minimum distributions. And she was talking, 5,000 here, 1,000 here. And really, we did some work together to think about, do you have some priority areas? But I do see that it's for many retirees that RMD amount is their starting point. And where some of our discussions can help them maybe think a little differently is, okay, so what do you want to do this year that supports organizations, annual operations that you care about? But thinking about, might this be an opportunity to start an endowment fund to support, whether it's an organization or an area that would be important to you? And that's something that you can allocate money to any year that you choose to, and that might align with something you're doing in your estate plan. Here's an opportunity, as we talked about before, to see that being used now. So I just see that for many retirees, that required minimum distribution is the starting point for them thinking about philanthropy.
Yeah, and I would also think that in some of those cases where they are six-figure numbers, and it is a client who has, maybe given out a couple $1,000s here and there, and maybe their charitable giving has added up to $10,000 over the course of the year. We're now in a different ball game, and having someone like you come to the table to be able to really help them could be very beneficial.
I hope so. And I understand that. For a lot of people, they've been building their businesses or they've been working, and their wealth is sort of accumulating, even despite their annual meetings with you, without them really thinking about it. And philanthropy may not have been a priority, and they write the checks they write every year. And now they have an opportunity to think bigger. They also have an opportunity to think differently about assets. The client I was talking about before, she's always been very charitable, But this was the first time that she had a conversation about an opportunity to give appreciated securities in her non-IRA portfolio and her taxable portfolio, and why that might be a great opportunity, especially with the Illinois Gives tax credit. She was working with a community foundation, had a couple of endowment funds established there to accelerate that and take advantage. And she used some RMD money, because you can do that and still benefit from that 25% Illinois tax credit.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing. I wish the limit were a little higher, but the statewide limit.
All right. So partnerships with nonprofits. Talk a little bit about how you work closely with nonprofit leaders and boards, and why is that perspective really valuable to donors?
Thank you for that question. So in some of my consulting work now, I do work directly with nonprofits and with their boards in helping them be more effective in how they raise money from individuals, and with boards to be more effective as the governing body for the organization. And most often in that area of what's their responsibility in raising money and how do they support staff well in doing that. I am careful, that is, to make sure that's not a conflict with any of my individual clients. And so far it has never been. And if there is an issue there, I would, of course I disclose that I've also done some consulting work with this organization. It does help me know them better, which is a good thing. Before I started as an independent advisor, I worked for 27 years with nonprofit organizations and universities. And that gives me a perspective of how they're managed, of how decisions are made in those organizations. It helps me understand what donor restrictions are manageable for a charitable organization, and when that may cross into creating more administrative burden and more expense for the organization. I understand their perspective and why they may wish to not accept certain restrictions or accept certain assets, and what may help them make those decisions. So I can bring that to the discussion with the individual about the gift they're thinking about. There are times when I'm working with a donor who wants to create a fund at a charity with certain restrictions on it. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, they're not going to want to accept those. So what I can do is try to dig a little deeper about why is that important to you? What are you trying to make sure happens? What are you concerned about that you're trying to prevent? And let's try to talk with the charity about how are they going to deal with this, and help the donor understand, especially if they're thinking about an endowment fund that's highly restricted. An endowment is like a diamond. It's forever. And we don't know what circumstances are going to be 30, 50 years from now. So how do you affect the kind of impact you want to, while allowing for some flexibility that needs within that group or that area of work may change?
One of the things that struck me when we first got to know each other, you gave a wonderful presentation, and you talked about your time working on the development side for two very large universities. And you spent some time on the other side of the table, especially as it comes to naming rights and large gifts that might be a building or an endowed share. And that there are legal covenants that usually accompany those types of large major gifts. And that your expertise can help a donor sort through that maybe their attorney is not as skilled as you are, because you've seen both sides of the equation. So talk a little bit about that.
Thank you for asking that.
We don't have a lot of people that are giving buildings, but I do think that is a skill set and a value that you bring to the table that I don't know anyone else can do.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, and it isn't just a building. I think the example I was giving, yes, he was making a $10 million gift towards a building project at a major university, not one of the ones I worked at. But even if it's a restricted gift of any kind, typically there is some kind of gift agreement or fund agreement involved if they're creating a named fund, an endowment fund, for instance. And some of them are pretty standard if it's a scholarship, unless there are a lot of restrictions on them. So certainly, especially given the size of that gift, his attorney was reviewing that also. But what an attorney is mostly going to review that for is potential risk to the donor legally or financially. What I was thinking about as I read that, first of all, it looked pretty standard to me, but I was able to think about, okay, there's a payment schedule that's aligned with the construction schedule. That's pretty typical for those kinds of gifts. Having worked at universities, I know that. But there was also building costs mentioned. Well, at what point are they determining those costs? Because right now there's an estimated project cost that this gift was built around. One of the things I learned is that they always cost more. It doesn't matter what kind of contingency is built into the number, it's always more. So I looked at that. I looked at where was this project in the approval process. It was a public university, I know, and all universities and major organizations, of course, are going to go through a series of approvals. But where was this? At what point was it with their board of trustees, et cetera? And I also looked to see, have there been any similar naming gifts? And did the donor feel like the naming he was getting was comparable and appropriate with this other naming gift? And then there were a few other things too, but really thinking about it from, are his interests protected as a donor, not just financially, but related to what his money's going to do? That's really what I think about when I'm entering, when I'm part of the negotiation or the review. In this case, it was at that point, I was just asked to review the gift agreement and make some recommendations to him. There were a couple of other things where I thought, from my experience, having done similar gifts from the charity's perspective, where I remembered donors negotiating certain things that I think were in their best interest. And we could have that conversation about, how important is it to you to have this flexibility or to have this kind of recognition?
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Shari, thank you so much. This was delightful. And I know we could probably sit and chat all day long about this. This is something that I get excited about. And as I work with my clients to establish a boardroom for them, you are definitely a valuable player for those who are charitably minded. So thank you for sharing your expertise and your thoughts today.
Well, thank you for having me. As you can tell, I could talk about this for forever as well. And your clients are very fortunate to have somebody who thinks about that boardroom.
Yeah, great.
So thank you for that.
All right. This has been a powerful conversation and a great example of how philanthropic consulting can enhance comprehensive planning for donors who want their wealth to reflect their values. So thank you so much for joining us today.